So it was summer 2018, and my friend Simon and I decided to take a trip to Queenstown, New Zealand. We had been planning this trip for months, and were super excited about it. I found us an Airbnb cabin that had a few hundred reviews and a 4-star rating, so I thought it was a pretty safe bet. The cabin was an old 2-room cabin with a small bathroom and kitchen. It looked rustic and charming in the photos. We packed our bags and headed out. The flight was long, but we were thrilled to finally land in Queenstown. The scenery was absolutely stunning with mountains and lakes everywhere. We rented a car and drove towards our cabin. On the way, we stopped at a grocery store to pick up some food items for our stay. That's when things started to get weird. While we were in the store, we noticed 2 guys who kept staring at us. At first, we thought maybe they were just curious because we were tourists. But then they started asking weird and random questions like, "Where are you from?" and "Where are you staying?" It was creepy as hell. Simon and I exchanged nervous glances and tried to answer politely but quickly. We hurriedly bought our groceries and got out of there as fast as we could. We finally arrived at the cabin. It was nestled in the woods, away from the hustle and bustle of the town. The place looked exactly like the pictures, old but charming. There was a small porch with 2 chairs, a living room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. It felt cozy and private, just what we needed for a relaxing getaway. We settled in, unpacked our stuff, and decided to cook dinner. As we were chopping vegetables and prepping the meal, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The windows didn't have any curtains, and the cabin was surrounded by trees. It was getting dark, and the woods outside looked dense and impenetrable. While we were eating, we heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps crunching on the gravel path leading to the cabin. We froze and listened carefully, but the sound stopped. Simon brushed it off, saying it was probably an animal. I tried to believe him, but something about it felt off. After dinner, we sat on the porch, enjoying the cool night air and the sounds of nature. We talked about our plans for the next day and tried to relax, but the eerie feeling from the grocery store encounter and the noises outside kept nagging at the back of my mind. As the night grew darker, we decided to head inside and call it a night. I took a quick shower and got ready for bed. Simon was in the living room reading a book. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard Simon's voice, tense and urgent. "Hey, did you hear that?" he asked. I sat up and listened. There it was again, the sound of footsteps, but this time they were closer and more deliberate. My heart started to pound. Simon and I exchanged worried looks. "Maybe we should check it out," he suggested. I nodded reluctantly, and we both grabbed our phones and flashlights. We slowly opened the door and stepped outside. The night was pitch black, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. We shone our flashlights around, but there was nothing there. Just as we were about to go back inside, we heard a rustling sound coming from the bushes near the cabin. Simon aimed his flashlight towards the noise, and that's when we saw them, the 2 guys from the grocery store. They were standing there, partially hidden by the bushes, staring at us with cold, calculating eyes. Fear surged through me. "What do you want?" Simon demanded, trying to sound brave. The men didn't answer. Instead, they started to slowly walk towards us. Panic set in, and we rushed back into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it. We grabbed a couple of chairs and wedged them under the doorknob for extra security. Our minds raced as we tried to figure out what to do. The cabin was isolated, and we had no immediate neighbors to call for help. Our phones had a weak signal, but we managed to get through to the local police. We explained the situation in hushed, frantic whispers, and they assured us that officers were on their way. We had no choice but to fight to survive through the night. We could hear the men outside trying to find a way in. They banged on the doors and windows, their voices low and menacing. Simon and I armed ourselves with whatever we could find, a kitchen knife and a heavy flashlight. We stayed close together, our backs against the wall, eyes fixed on the door. Time seemed to stretch on forever. Every minute felt like an hour as we waited in terrified silence, praying for the police to arrive. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, we heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The men outside must have heard it too, because the banging stopped abruptly. We heard them running away, their footsteps fading into the night. The police arrived moments later. They searched the area but didn't find the men. They took our statements and assured us they would patrol the area more frequently. We were shaken but relieved to be safe. The rest of our trip was a blur. We left the cabin the next morning and checked into a hotel in town. We couldn't shake the feeling of fear and paranoia. What started as a fun getaway had turned into a nightmare that we would never forget. If there's one thing I learned from this experience, it's to always trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And no matter how many stars an Airbnb has, you can never be too careful. Thanks for listening to our story. Stay safe out there, everyone. I'd been looking forward to my weekend getaway for months. Between the demands of work and the pressures of daily life, the idea of escaping to a secluded Airbnb in the countryside was a balm for my weary soul. The place I'd chosen was perfect. A rustic cottage nestled in a small village surrounded by dense forests and far from the buzz of city life. I arrived late on Friday afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows over the rolling hills. The cottage was exactly as it appeared in the photos, quaint and charming, with ivy clinging to its stone walls and a small, well-tended garden at the front. I parked my car and grabbed my bags, feeling the tension ease from my shoulders. The host, an elderly woman named Mrs. Whitaker, met me at the door. She was kind and welcoming, with a warm smile that instantly made me feel at home. She gave me a quick tour of the cottage, showing me the cozy living room, the fully equipped kitchen, and the comfortable bedroom. Everything was perfect. "I hope you enjoy your stay," she said, handing me the keys. "If you need anything, my house is just up the road." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker," I replied. "I'm sure I will." After she left, I settled in and decided to explore the area. The village was small, with only a handful of houses and a single narrow road winding through it. I walked through the woods, breathing in the fresh pine-scented air, and feeling more relaxed than I had in a long time. As dusk fell, I returned to the cottage and cooked myself a simple dinner. I spent the evening reading by the fireplace, the crackling flames providing a comforting background noise. By the time I went to bed, I felt completely at ease. But that night, I woke up abruptly. The room was pitch dark, and for a moment, I couldn't understand what had disturbed my sleep. Then I heard it. A soft rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the house. I sat up, my heart pounding. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the living room. I got out of bed, careful not to make any noise, and tiptoed down the hallway. The tapping grew louder as I approached the living room door. I reached for the light switch, hesitated, then flicked it on. The room was empty. The tapping had stopped. I stood there feeling a bit foolish and then decided it was probably just the house settling or an animal outside. I turned off the light and went back to bed. The next day I explored more of the surrounding area. The village had a small market where I bought some fresh produce and chatted with the friendly locals. They all knew Mrs. Whitaker and spoke highly of her. I mentioned the tapping sound from the previous night, and they assured me it was probably just the old house making noises. That night I went to bed early, determined to get a good night's sleep. But once again, I was woken up by the same rhythmic tapping. This time I was more annoyed than scared. I got out of bed and walked to the living room. The sound was louder now, insistent. I turned on the light and there it was, an old wooden rocking chair in the corner of the room, moving slowly back and forth. I froze, staring at it. The chair stopped moving. My mind raced. Had Mrs. Whitaker mentioned anything about a rocking chair? I couldn't remember. I approached the chair cautiously and examined it. There was nothing unusual about it, just an old piece of furniture. I pushed it gently and it rocked back and forth, the sound matching the tapping I'd heard. I felt a wave of relief. It was just the chair, probably moving on its own due to a draft or uneven floorboards. I returned to bed, still feeling uneasy but more reassured. The next morning, I decided to ask Mrs. Whitaker about the chair. I walked up the road to her house and knocked on the door. She answered with a smile. "Good morning, how's the cottage?" she asked. "Everything's great," I said, hesitating. I did have a question about the rocking chair in the living room, though. It's been moving on its own at night. Mrs. Whitaker's smile faltered. "Rocking chair? I'm afraid there's no rocking chair in the cottage." My heart skipped a beat. But I saw it. It was definitely there. She shook her head, looking genuinely concerned. "I've never placed a rocking chair in that house. Perhaps you're mistaken?" I returned to the cottage, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? No, I was certain I'd seen it. That night I stayed up late, determined to catch the chair in the act. I sat in the living room, lights off, listening. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak. Around midnight, the tapping started again. My pulse quickened. I turned on the light, and there it was, the rocking chair, moving back and forth. I grabbed my phone and took a picture. I needed proof. The next morning, I showed the photo to Mrs. Whitaker. She looked at it, her face pale. "I don't understand," she whispered. "That chair has never been in the cottage. I don't know how it got there." Her reaction sent chills down my spine. I returned to the cottage, determined to figure out what was happening. I examined the chair closely, looking for any clues. That's when I noticed something odd. A faint carving on the underside of the seat. It looked like initials, barely visible. I spent the rest of the day researching, trying to find any information about the chair or the initials. I found nothing. That night, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I sat in the living room, waiting for the tapping to start. When it did, I turned on the light and spoke aloud. "Who are you? What do you want?" The chair continued to rock, the tapping growing louder. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of unease. I backed away, my heart pounding. Then, as suddenly as it started, the rocking stopped. The house was silent once more. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room watching the chair, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. By morning, I was exhausted and decided to leave the cottage early. I packed my bags and drove away, my mind racing with unanswered questions. As I drove back to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something important. I thought about the initials, the chair, and Mrs. Whitaker's reaction. It wasn't until I was almost home that a thought struck me. What if the chair wasn't meant to be in the cottage? What if it had been moved there for a reason? The idea nagged at me, and I knew I wouldn't find peace until I had answers. I decided to contact the previous guests of the cottage, hoping they might know something. It took a few days, but I eventually tracked down a couple who had stayed there a few months before. When I called them, they were hesitant at first, but eventually shared their story. They too had heard the tapping and seen the chair. But unlike me, they had found something else, a hidden compartment in the chair's seat. Inside, they had discovered an old, faded photograph of a young girl. I asked if they still had the photo, but they said they'd left it in the compartment, unsure of what to do with it. I thanked them and hung up, feeling a sense of dread. I knew I had to go back to the cottage and find that photograph. I returned to the cottage the following weekend. Mrs. Whitaker seemed surprised to see me but didn't question my return. I went straight to the chair and found the hidden compartment. Inside was the photograph, just as the couple had described. The girl in the photo looked about 8 years old, with long dark hair and a solemn expression. On the back of the photo, someone had written a date, June 12th, 1947. I stared at it, trying to make sense of it all. Who was this girl, and why was her photo hidden in the chair? I decided to visit the local historical society, hoping they might have some records or information. The staff there were friendly and helpful. After some searching, They found a newspaper article from 1947 about a missing girl named Emily who had disappeared from the village. The article included a photo of Emily, and it was the same girl from the photograph. According to the article, she had vanished without a trace, and despite extensive searches, she was never found. As I read the article, a chill ran down my spine. I realized that the initials on the chair must belong to Emily. But why was the chair moving on its own? Was Emily trying to communicate something? I spent the next few days researching Emily's disappearance, but I found no new information. Frustrated, I returned to the cottage one last time. I sat in the living room holding the photograph and spoke aloud. "Emily, if you're here, please tell me what you want." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the chair began to rock again, slowly at first, then more vigorously. The tapping grew louder, almost frantic. I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and the photograph slipped from my fingers, landing face down on the floor. I picked it up and saw new writing on the back, as if someone had just written it. "Find me." I knew then that I couldn't ignore this any longer. Emily was trying to tell me something, and I had to find her. I began searching the cottage, looking for any clues. It wasn't until I checked the cellar that I found something. An old, dusty trunk hidden behind a stack of firewood. Inside the trunk were more photographs, letters, and a small worn journal. The journal belonged to Emily and detailed her life in the village. The last entry was dated the day she disappeared. She wrote about meeting a man who promised to take her on an adventure, but she felt uneasy about it. I took the journal and photographs to the Historical Society, and they helped me piece together the story. The man Emily wrote about was a drifter who had been seen in the village around the time she disappeared. He was suspected in her disappearance but was never found. With this new information, the local authorities were able to reopen the case. They eventually located the drifter, now an old man living in another state. He confessed to taking Emily and led them to her remains, buried in a shallow grave in the woods. Emily's case was finally solved, and she was given a proper burial. The rocking chair never moved again, and the cottage felt different, lighter. I felt a sense of closure, knowing I had helped give Emily the peace she deserved. I left the village with a heavy heart, but also with a sense of accomplishment. I had come to the countryside for a simple getaway, but ended up uncovering a decades-old mystery. The experience changed me, making me more attuned to the subtle signs and whispers of the past. As I drove back to the city, I thought about Emily and the lives we touch, even unknowingly. The world is full of mysteries, some hidden in plain sight waiting for someone to listen and uncover the truth. It all started early last spring break when my best friend Bucky decided we should hit up a club in Kingston for a night of fun. We were really excited and had a blast, dancing and enjoying ourselves. But as the night went on, it got really late, and we realized we were in no condition to drive back home. Bucky suggested we rent an Airbnb nearby, so we wouldn't have to worry about driving tired. It seemed like a good idea at the time, so we quickly found a place that looked nice enough and booked it. Little did we know we were about to walk into one of the most terrifying nights of our lives. The Airbnb was in a quiet neighborhood, nothing too fancy, just a small, cozy house. When we arrived, everything seemed normal. The host had left the key under the mat as instructed, and we let ourselves in. The place looked clean and well decorated, with modern furniture and a minimalist vibe. We were tired, but the adrenaline from the night kept us up for a while. Bucky decided to crash on the couch while I took the bedroom. As I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. There was a decorative plant on the dresser, but it seemed oddly placed. I went to move it and saw a small blinking light underneath. My heart skipped a beat when I realized it was a camera. I called Bucky over, and we started searching the rest of the house. To our horror, we found more hidden cameras in the living room, kitchen, and even the bathroom. They were cleverly concealed behind picture frames, plants, and other decorations. We were both freaked out and didn't know what to do. We felt so violated. knowing someone had been watching us. We decided to call the host, but there was no answer. Panicking, we packed up our things and left as quickly as we could. It was around 3 a.m. by this point, and we ended up driving to a nearby hotel instead. I couldn't sleep at all that night thinking about how we had been spied on. The next morning, we reported the Airbnb to the company and the authorities. They took our complaint seriously, and an investigation was launched. It turned out the host had installed the cameras without any permission, and the place was removed from the platform. Even though the cameras were removed, the experience left me paranoid for a long time. I started double-checking every place I stayed, looking for hidden devices, and it took a while before I felt safe again in any rental.